Number 1. Yoshio Kodaira. Long before modern Japan became known for its order, technology, and strict public safety, the country passed through decades of war, social upheaval, and deep national trauma. During those turbulent years of the 1930s and 1940s, while the nation focused its attention on military expansion and the chaos of World War II, a quiet and deeply disturbed man was moving through the shadows of Japanese society. His name was Yoshio Kodaira, and by the time the authorities finally arrested him, he had become one of the earliest known serial killers in modern Japanese history. Kodaira was born in 1905 in the rural countryside of Tochigi Prefecture. His early life was shaped by poverty and the rigid discipline that defined Japanese society at the beginning of the 20th century. Families were expected to follow strict hierarchies. Children were raised with strong expectations of obedience, respect, and emotional restraint. But even within this environment, Kodaira stood apart. From a young age, he struggled to fit into the social order around him. Accounts from people who knew him later described a quiet, brooding boy who rarely showed emotion. While many children of the era worked hard to support their families and contribute to their communities, Kodaira seemed disconnected from those expectations. As he grew older, his behavior became more troubling. In his teenage years, Kodaira was reportedly involved in incidents of theft and violence. Local authorities became aware of him after several petty crimes, and he eventually served time in prison for robbery. The experience hardened him further, isolating him from whatever limited connections he had once maintained with society. But the most significant turning point in Kodaira's life came when he joined the Japanese military. Like many young men of his generation, Kodaira was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. During a period when Japan was expanding its influence across Asia, military service exposed him to a brutal environment, where violence was not only tolerated but often encouraged. During his time in the army, Kodaira was stationed in China, where Japanese forces were involved in some of the most violent campaigns of the war. According to later investigations, Kodaira participated in acts of extreme cruelty while stationed abroad. Some reports suggested that he committed assaults and murders against civilians during the conflict. Though the chaos of war made it difficult to document these crimes fully, what is clear is that the experience deeply affected him. The violence he witnessed and possibly committed appeared to remove whatever psychological barriers had previously restrained his darkest impulses. When the war ended and Kodaira returned to Japan in the mid-1940s, he came back to a country devastated by defeat. Cities lay in ruins from bombing campaigns. Millions of people struggled with poverty, unemployment, and displacement. The social structure that had once maintained strict control over individuals was weakened by the sudden collapse of the imperial government. For someone like Kodaira, the chaos created an opportunity. In the years immediately following World War II, law enforcement agencies across Japan were overwhelmed. Police resources were stretched thin as authorities dealt with black markets, political unrest, and widespread crime. Amid that disorder, Kodaira began committing the crimes that would eventually make him infamous. His victims were primarily young women. Many were workers or students navigating the difficult conditions of post-war Japan, where public transportation and city streets were often poorly lit and sparsely monitored. Kodaira used deception to approach them. He sometimes pretended to be offering help or assistance, striking up casual conversations before persuading victims to walk with him into more isolated areas. Once he had them alone, the attacks began. The murders were brutal. Kodaira assaulted his victims and then strangled them, often leaving their bodies in remote locations where discovery might take days or weeks. Because Japan was experiencing widespread social disruption, some victims were not immediately reported missing. This delay helped him continue killing without detection. Over time, however, police began noticing disturbing similarities among several unsolved murders. Young women had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Their bodies showed signs of violent assault, and in many cases, the locations suggested that the killer had deliberately chosen areas where witnesses were unlikely. Investigators slowly began piecing together the possibility that a serial predator was operating within the region, but tracking him proved difficult. Japan's police forces in the late 1940s lacked many of the forensic technologies used today. There were no computerized databases, no DNA analysis, and limited methods for linking crimes across different jurisdictions. Meanwhile, Kodaira continued living an outwardly normal life. He moved through cities and towns without attracting suspicion, blending into the enormous population of people trying to rebuild their lives after the war. By the time investigators began narrowing their search for a suspect, Kodaira had already committed numerous murders. His eventual arrest came in 1946. Police had been investigating the disappearance of a woman when evidence led them to question Kodaira. During interrogation, detectives noticed inconsistencies in his story and began pressing him for more information. At first, he denied involvement, but as questioning continued, his resistance began to break. Eventually, Kodaira confessed. What he revealed stunned investigators. He admitted to killing multiple women in the years following the war. Some confessions also suggested that his crimes had begun earlier, possibly during his military service. Authorities were able to link him definitively to at least 8 murders, though many experts believed the real number was significantly higher. During his trial, Kodaira showed little remorse. Observers noted his unsettling calmness as he described the crimes. When asked why he committed the murders, he provided vague explanations that suggested a deep sense of anger and resentment towards society. Psychological evaluations conducted during the trial indicated that Kodaira displayed traits associated with severe antisocial personality disorder. He appeared emotionally detached from the suffering of his victims and seemed incapable of genuine empathy. The case attracted enormous attention in post-war Japan. The country was still struggling to rebuild its institutions and restore a sense of order. The revelation that a serial killer had been operating during this fragile period shocked the public and intensified fears about rising crime. In 1948, the court found Yoshio Kodaira guilty of multiple counts of murder. He was sentenced to death. Japan at the time still practiced capital punishment, and executions were carried out by hanging. Later that year, Kodaira was executed in a Tokyo detention center. His death brought an official end to the case, but the impact of his crimes continued to resonate. For many historians and criminologists, Kodaira represents one of the earliest documented examples of a modern serial killer in Japan. His case also highlighted how social instability can create conditions where predators operate more easily. The chaos of post-war society allowed him to hide among millions of struggling citizens, exploiting the lack of resources and coordination among law enforcement agencies. In the decades that followed, Japan would develop one of the most effective policing systems in the world, with extremely low homicide rates compared to many other countries. But the story of Yoshio Kodaira remains a reminder that even societies known for order and safety are not immune to the presence of individuals capable of extreme violence. For the women who crossed his path during those desperate years after the war, the danger came not from armies or political upheaval. It came from a quiet man walking through the ruins of a broken country, carrying with him a darkness that no one recognized until it was far too late. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 2. Mutsuo Toi. In the early hours of May 21, 1938, a quiet farming community in rural Japan was plunged into unimaginable horror. The small mountain hamlet of Kamo, located near the city of Tsuyama, in Okayama Prefecture, was a place where everyone knew everyone else. Families had lived there for generations, and life followed the predictable rhythm of planting, harvesting, and seasonal festivals. But that night, the silence of the countryside was shattered by gunfire and screams. The man responsible was Mutsuo Toi, a 21-year-old villager who would go on to commit one of the most infamous mass killings in Japanese history, the Tsuyama Massacre. By the time the sun rose that morning, 30 people were dead, and the village would never be the same again. To understand how such a tragedy unfolded, one must first understand the environment in which Toi grew up. Mutsuo Toi was born in 1917 in a small rural community surrounded by forests and rice fields. Life in the region was simple and isolated. Modern conveniences were rare, and traditions governed nearly every aspect of daily life. When Toi was young, his parents died, leaving him and his twin sister to be raised by their grandmother. Their home stood on a hillside overlooking the rest of the village. For a time, Toi seemed like an ordinary boy. He attended local school, helped with farm work, and blended into village life. But as he grew older, people began to notice that something about him was different. He was quiet, painfully quiet. He kept to himself, and rarely joined in the conversations or gatherings that were common among the villagers. Some said he preferred reading books alone rather than spending time with friends. Others whispered that he had a temper. But in a small village where everyone depended on each other, people tended to overlook unusual behavior. That would prove to be a fatal mistake. In his late teenage years, Toi was diagnosed with tuberculosis, a disease that carried enormous stigma at the time. In 1930s Japan, tuberculosis was feared not only because it was deadly, but because it required isolation to prevent the spread of infection. Once word of his illness spread, the villagers began treating him differently. They avoided him. Neighbors stopped visiting his house. Some refused to share tools or food with him. Others simply crossed the road when they saw him coming. For Toi, the rejection cut deeply. He began spending more and more time alone in his home on the hill. Loneliness slowly turned into resentment. The night-crawling tradition, one strange aspect of rural Japanese culture during that era, played an unexpected role in the tragedy. The practice was known as yobai, often translated as night-crawling. It was an old rural custom in which young men secretly visited women at night to pursue romantic or sexual relationships. While it might seem shocking by modern standards, it was not unusual in isolated farming communities at the time. Before his illness, Toi had reportedly participated in this practice and had relationships with several women in the village. But once he was labeled as a tuberculosis patient, those relationships ended abruptly. Women who had once welcomed him now refused to see him. Toi reportedly felt humiliated and betrayed. In his mind, the village had turned against him. During the months leading up to the massacre, Toi's behavior grew increasingly strange. He spent hours alone, reading military manuals and crime stories. He also began collecting weapons. Under Japan's military culture of the time, rifles and ammunition were sometimes kept in rural households. Toi secretly gathered firearms and practiced shooting in the mountains. Villagers occasionally heard gunshots echoing through the hills, but assumed he was hunting. No one realized he was preparing for something far more sinister. At the same time, Toi began writing in a notebook. The entries revealed a mind consumed by anger and humiliation. He wrote about the people who had rejected him and described fantasies of revenge. He also composed what would later be discovered as a suicide note. On the evening of May 20th, 1938, Toi began his final preparations. He shaved his head. He dressed in dark clothing. Then he attached 2 flashlights to his head, creating a crude headlamp so he could see in the darkness while keeping both hands free for his weapons. It was a chillingly calculated decision. He armed himself with a Type 38 rifle, a shotgun, a sword, hundreds of rounds of ammunition before leaving his home. He committed the first murders of the night. Inside the house were the 2 people who had raised him, his grandmother and his beloved twin sister. Investigators later concluded that Toi killed them while they slept. Some believed he did this because he didn't want them to witness what he was about to do. Others believed it was because he planned to commit suicide afterward and didn't want to leave them behind in shame. Whatever the reason, their deaths marked the beginning of a night of unimaginable violence. Shortly before 2 a.m., Toi descended the hill toward the village. The countryside was silent. Most villagers were asleep inside their wooden homes. The first neighbors he encountered had no idea what was happening. Toi fired his rifle through windows and doors, killing people as they slept. Others were shot as they tried to flee into the night. Some victims were cut down with a sword when his gun temporarily ran out of ammunition. Panic spread rapidly through the village, but in the darkness, with gunfire echoing through the narrow valley, many residents had no idea where the attacker was coming from. For more than an hour, Toi moved from house to house. His head-mounted lights made him look like a ghostly figure emerging from the darkness. Survivors later described hearing footsteps outside their homes, followed by sudden gunshots. Some families hid under blankets or inside storage rooms. Others ran into the forest, hoping the darkness would protect them. But Toi knew the village well. He targeted specific homes, particularly those connected to people who had rejected or insulted him. By the time the attack ended, 30 people were dead. Most were shot. Others died from sword wounds. The victims included men, women, and even elderly villagers who had no connection to Toi's personal grievances. The small hamlet had effectively been devastated in a single night, but Toi's rampage was not yet finished. As dawn approached, Toi climbed back into the hills overlooking the village. Police and villagers had begun searching for him. Knowing he would soon be captured, Toi took out a notebook and wrote a final message. It was a mixture of apology and justification. He expressed anger toward the villagers who had rejected him, and wrote that he could not bear the humiliation of living with tuberculosis and social isolation. Shortly afterward, he used his rifle to take his own life. His body was discovered later that morning on a mountain slope overlooking the village he had just destroyed. He was only 21 years old. News of the Tsuyama Massacre spread quickly across Japan. At the time, the country was already deep into the militarization leading up to World War II, and stories of mass violence inside Japan itself were extremely rare. Newspapers struggled to explain how such a crime could occur. Some reports blamed tuberculosis, others blamed the isolation of rural communities, but many observers believed the tragedy was the result of a toxic mixture of social rejection, humiliation, and untreated mental illness. Even decades later, the massacre remains one of the most infamous crimes in Japanese history. The village eventually rebuilt, but the memory of that night never disappeared. For years, survivors avoided speaking about the tragedy. Families who lost loved ones struggled to move on, and the name Mutsuo Toi became permanently associated with one of the darkest chapters in the country's criminal history. The story also inspired books, documentaries, and films exploring the psychology behind the massacre. To this day, criminologists study the case as an example of how social isolation and resentment can spiral into catastrophic violence. More than 80 years have passed since that night in 1938. The mountains surrounding Tsuyama are peaceful once again. Rice fields stretch across the valleys, and small homes dot the countryside. Visitors who pass through the region today might never realize what happened there, but for those who know the story, the memory remains chilling. One angry young man, one night of revenge, and 30 lives lost in a quiet village that never imagined such horror could happen in their midst. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 3. Kiyoshi Okubo. In the early 1970s, Japan was experiencing rapid transformation. Cities were expanding, highways were being built across the countryside, and young people were traveling farther than ever before. The nation had entered a new era of economic growth and modernization. But hidden beneath that optimism was a case that would shock the country and expose a terrifying predator moving quietly through rural roads. The man responsible was Kiyoshi Okubo, a young man whose seemingly ordinary life masked violent impulses that would eventually claim multiple victims. His crimes, later known as the Gunma serial murders, became one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Japan during that decade. Okubo was born in 1935 and grew up during a turbulent time in Japanese history. His childhood was shaped by the aftermath of war and a society struggling to rebuild itself. Like many young men of his generation, he sought stability and purpose as Japan modernized. On the surface, he appeared to live a relatively typical life. He worked various jobs, interacted with people in his community, and blended easily into the everyday flow of society. But beneath that ordinary exterior was a man who carried deep frustrations and a dangerous capacity for violence. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, Okubo began spending more time traveling through rural regions of Gunma Prefecture, an area north of Tokyo known for its mountains, quiet towns, and winding roads. These highways connected smaller communities and were frequently used by young people trying to reach nearby cities. At the time, hitchhiking was relatively common in Japan. Travelers, especially young women, often relied on rides from passing motorists to move between towns. The roads that cut through Gunma's countryside were long and isolated, with stretches where few people would pass for hours. For someone with violent intentions, it was the perfect hunting ground. In 1971, the first signs of something sinister began to emerge. Reports surfaced about a young woman who had disappeared after accepting a ride from a driver while traveling along one of Gunma's roads. At first, authorities assumed she might have simply left town or chosen not to return home. But then another woman vanished under similar circumstances, and then another. Each case shared a chilling similarity. The victims were young women traveling alone, who had last been seen entering a vehicle driven by an unknown man. The disappearances seemed random at first, but investigators began to suspect that a predator was targeting vulnerable travelers. Fear slowly spread through the region. Parents warned their daughters not to hitchhike. Travelers became more cautious when accepting rides. Rumors circulated that a killer might be roaming the highways of Gunma Prefecture. Meanwhile, Kiyoshi Okubo continued his life, as though nothing unusual was happening. He drove through the same roads where the disappearances had taken place. To anyone who encountered him, he appeared calm and ordinary. But investigators would later discover that these drives were not random journeys. They were calculated opportunities to find victims. Okubo's method was deceptively simple. He would spot a young woman walking along a rural road or waiting for transportation and offer her a ride. His demeanor helped him appear trustworthy. Once the victim entered his vehicle, she would unknowingly place herself in the control of a man whose intentions were far from harmless. At first, the conversation would seem normal. He would drive along quiet country roads, sometimes talking casually as though he was simply helping someone reach their destination. But eventually the atmosphere would change. The isolated roads of Gunma meant that there were few witnesses and little chance of escape. Once Okubo had driven far enough away from populated areas, he would reveal his true intentions. His attacks were brutal and sudden, leaving victims with little opportunity to fight back. The murders shocked investigators, not only because of their violence, but because of how easily the killer had moved through society without suspicion. For months, authorities struggled to identify the person responsible. Japan in the early 1970s did not yet have the advanced forensic tools that would later revolutionize criminal investigations. Detectives relied heavily on witness testimony, physical evidence, and patient investigative work. But the killer had chosen his hunting grounds carefully. Remote highways offered few witnesses. Victims often had no connection to each other, making it difficult to identify a pattern quickly. Despite the challenges, investigators began assembling fragments of information. Witnesses reported seeing a particular car near some of the locations where victims had last been seen. Descriptions of the driver varied, but they pointed toward a man traveling alone through rural areas. Police began increasing patrols along the highways and questioning motorists. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Gunma grew tense. Newspapers reported on the mysterious disappearances, and people across Japan followed the unfolding story with growing unease. Eventually, the investigation reached a turning point. Authorities began focusing on Kiyoshi Okubo after information connected him to areas where victims had disappeared. His movements along the highways matched the timeline of several cases. Suspicion quickly grew as detectives examined his background and questioned him about his activities. What they discovered would soon confirm their fears. Evidence began linking Okubo directly to the murders. Details of his travels and inconsistencies in his statements raised serious doubts about his innocence. As investigators pressed further, the quiet and seemingly cooperative man they were questioning began to reveal a much darker reality. Okubo eventually confessed. His admissions stunned the nation. He described how he had targeted young women traveling alone, offering them rides before attacking them in isolated areas. The confessions provided horrifying details about the crimes and confirmed what investigators had feared for months. A serial killer had indeed been stalking the roads of Gunma. Authorities connected him to multiple murders, revealing a pattern of predatory behavior that had gone undetected until several lives had already been lost. The trial that followed became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Japan during that era. Courtrooms filled with journalists, investigators, and members of the public eager to understand how such crimes could occur in a country often perceived as one of the safest in the world. During the proceedings, prosecutors laid out the evidence against Okubo in detail. They described how he had used his vehicle as a tool to lure victims, and how the isolation of rural roads had allowed him to commit his crimes without immediate detection. The testimony painted a disturbing picture of a man who had carefully exploited trust and vulnerability. Defense attorneys attempted to explore psychological factors behind his actions, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The brutality of the crimes and the number of victims left little doubt about the outcome of the case. Okubo was ultimately found guilty of multiple murders. The verdict brought a measure of closure to the families who had lost loved ones, but it also forced Japan to confront uncomfortable questions about safety and trust. For many people, the case shattered the assumption that violent predators were rare in Japanese society. The story of Kiyoshi Okubo became widely discussed in newspapers, crime books, and later documentaries. Criminologists examined the case as an example of how ordinary environments can sometimes hide extraordinary dangers. The murders also changed public attitudes about hitchhiking and traveling alone on remote roads. What had once been considered a normal part of rural life suddenly seemed far more risky. Years later, the highways of Gunma would return to their quiet routines. Cars would pass through mountain valleys, and travelers would move between towns without thinking about the dark history hidden in those roads. But the memory of the crimes remained. For investigators who worked the case, the lessons were unforgettable. The investigation highlighted the importance of recognizing patterns in seemingly unrelated crimes and the need for persistent detective work, even when evidence is scarce. For the families of the victims, however, the tragedy could never truly fade. Each life lost represented a person with dreams, relationships, and a future that was suddenly cut short by a stranger who had chosen to exploit their trust. And for Japan, the story served as a chilling reminder that even in places known for safety and order, the potential for violence can sometimes exist where it is least expected. The quiet roads of Gunma once became the hunting ground of a killer who believed he could move unnoticed through the countryside. For a time, he succeeded, but eventually the truth emerged, exposing the man behind the crimes and bringing an end to a series of murders that had shaken the nation. The name Kiyoshi Okubo would remain permanently associated with one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Japan's modern history, a reminder that beneath ordinary appearances, darkness can sometimes hide in plain sight. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 4. Tsutomu Miyazaki. In the late 1980s, Japan was at the height of its economic boom. Tokyo's skyline was filling with new buildings, businesses were thriving, and the country seemed to be entering a new era of prosperity and technological advancement. Yet, during that same period, a series of crimes began unfolding that would horrify the entire nation and shatter the sense of safety many people believed existed within Japanese society. The man responsible was Tsutomu Miyazaki, a quiet and socially isolated young man who would eventually be linked to some of the most disturbing crimes in modern Japanese history. His case became so infamous that the media would later give him a chilling nickname, the Otaku murderer. Miyazaki was born in 1962 in Tokyo and grew up in a relatively comfortable household. His family owned a local newspaper business, and financially they were far from struggling. But despite the stability of his home environment, Miyazaki's early life was marked by a deep sense of isolation. He was born with a physical deformity affecting his hands, a condition that made his wrists appear unusually small and his palms narrow. Throughout his childhood, this difference became a source of embarrassment and insecurity. Classmates often noticed his unusual appearance, and Miyazaki gradually withdrew from social interactions. Teachers later described him as quiet and distant. He rarely spoke in class and seemed disconnected from other students. While some children develop resilience in the face of bullying or insecurity, Miyazaki instead retreated deeper into solitude. As he grew older, that isolation intensified. He spent increasing amounts of time alone in his room, avoiding friends and social gatherings. Eventually he developed an intense obsession with videos, manga, and animation. His room began filling with thousands of tapes, magazines, and recordings. At the time, Japanese pop culture was experiencing an explosion of animated content and home video media. For most people, it was simply entertainment. But for Miyazaki, it became an escape from reality. He would spend hours watching recordings, rarely interacting with the outside world. After graduating from school, Miyazaki struggled to find a stable career. He briefly attended photography school but dropped out. He worked several small jobs, including positions in printing and photography businesses. But nothing seemed to hold his interest for long. By the mid-1980s, he was living largely within a private world of isolation and fantasy. Then, in 1988, the first crime occurred. In August of that year, a 4-year-old girl disappeared while playing near her home in Tokyo's western suburbs. The neighborhood was quiet and residential, the type of place where parents often felt comfortable allowing their children to play outside. When the child suddenly vanished, her family initially believed she might have wandered away, but hours passed with no sign of her. Soon, police were searching the area, and the case began attracting attention in local news reports. What investigators did not know was that Tsutomu Miyazaki had already committed the crime. Using his car, Miyazaki had approached the child and abducted her. The attack was brutal and shocking even by the standards of experienced detectives. After killing the girl, Miyazaki did something that deeply disturbed investigators once the truth was uncovered. He returned to the scene later and took photographs of the victim. The case immediately became one of the most horrifying child murder investigations in Japan. But at that moment, police had almost no clues. Miyazaki had left little evidence behind, and the quiet suburban area where the crime occurred offered few witnesses. Several months later, another child disappeared. This time the victim was a 7-year-old girl walking near her home. Like the first case, the disappearance appeared sudden and mysterious. Once again, investigators found themselves struggling to identify a suspect. The pattern continued. Over the course of several months, multiple young girls were abducted and murdered. Each crime left families devastated and communities terrified. Parents began refusing to let their children walk to school alone. Neighborhood groups organized patrols. Media coverage intensified as journalists tried to understand who could be responsible for such horrific acts. The killer seemed to appear and disappear without leaving clear traces. Investigators gradually realized they were dealing with a serial offender who carefully targeted vulnerable victims. The crimes showed signs of planning, but they also contained disturbing elements that suggested a deeply disturbed mind. While the investigation continued, Miyazaki remained unnoticed. He continued living with his family, spending most of his time alone watching videos and collecting media. His room became packed with tapes stacked from floor to ceiling. Neighbors occasionally noticed his strange behavior, but nothing about him immediately suggested the crimes he had committed. Then, in 1989, something finally went wrong for the killer. One afternoon, Miyazaki encountered another young girl while driving through a residential area. As he had done before, he attempted to lure her toward his car. But this time the situation unfolded differently. The child resisted and began screaming. Her cries attracted the attention of her father, who rushed outside and confronted the suspicious driver. Realizing he had been noticed, Miyazaki panicked and fled the scene in his vehicle. The father managed to record part of the car's license plate number and reported the incident to police. That single detail became the break investigators had been desperately seeking. Detectives traced the vehicle registration and quickly identified the owner, Tsutomu Miyazaki. When police searched his home, what they discovered shocked the entire nation. Inside Miyazaki's room were thousands of videotapes, magazines, and recordings stacked in towering piles. Some contained horror films and violent content. Others were home recordings of television broadcasts. The sheer volume of media immediately attracted intense media attention. But far more disturbing was the evidence investigators discovered linking him to the murders. Photographs, belongings connected to victims, and other items confirmed that the quiet young man living among stacks of tapes was the serial killer they had been searching for. When Miyazaki was arrested, the news exploded across Japan. Television networks broadcast images of his cluttered room filled with tapes. Newspapers ran headlines describing the shocking discovery. The case quickly became one of the most sensational criminal stories in modern Japanese history. During interrogation, Miyazaki confessed to the murders, but his explanations only deepened the sense of horror surrounding the case. He described feeling disconnected from society and claimed he sometimes believed he was being controlled by a mysterious entity he referred to as Rat Man. Investigators struggled to determine whether these statements reflected genuine psychological disturbance or attempts to avoid responsibility. The trial that followed lasted several years and became a major national event. Psychiatric experts examined Miyazaki extensively, debating whether he was legally sane at the time of the murders. Defense attorneys argued that he suffered from severe mental illness, while prosecutors insisted he had clearly planned and carried out the crimes deliberately. The court proceedings revealed disturbing details about his behavior and psychological state. Evidence showed that he had returned to crime scenes, contacted victims' families anonymously, and preserved items connected to the crimes. These revelations intensified public outrage and grief. Japan had rarely encountered a criminal case with such shocking elements. For many people, the discovery of Miyazaki's massive collection of media tapes sparked debates about youth culture, animation, and the influence of violent entertainment. The word otaku, which originally referred to someone deeply obsessed with hobbies like anime or video games, suddenly took on negative connotations because of the case. Although millions of fans had nothing to do with crime, the media frequently connected Miyazaki's behavior to his obsessive interests. Eventually, the court reached its verdict. Miyazaki was found guilty of the murders. After years of appeals and legal proceedings, he was sentenced to death. The decision reflected the severity of the crimes and the enormous impact they had on Japanese society. The case remained in public discussion for decades. Parents continued referencing it when discussing child safety. Criminologists studied the investigation and the psychological aspects of the killer's behavior, and the name Tsutomu Miyazaki became permanently associated with one of the darkest chapters in Japan's criminal history. Even today, the case continues to appear in documentaries, books, and academic research examining serial crime in Japan. The quiet suburban neighborhoods where the crimes occurred eventually returned to normal life. Children once again walked through the streets on their way to school, and families tried to rebuild their sense of security. But for those who remembered the events of the late 1980s, the memory remained deeply unsettling. The crimes committed by Tsutomu Miyazaki had revealed something many people preferred not to think about: that even in a country widely known for its safety and order, unimaginable darkness could still emerge from behind the most ordinary doors. A quiet young man living in a comfortable home, a room filled with thousands of videotapes, and a series of crimes that would shock an entire nation and forever changed the way Japan viewed one of its most disturbing killers. What part of this case shocked you the most? Number 5. Futoshi Matsunaga. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Japan experienced one of the most disturbing criminal cases in its modern history. Unlike many serial murder cases driven by a single killer acting alone, this story involved manipulation, psychological control, and a level of cruelty that investigators themselves struggled to comprehend. At the center of the case was Futoshi Matsunaga, a man who used deception, intimidation, and mind games to dominate and destroy the lives of the people around him. The crimes later became known as the Kitakyushu confinement murders, a case so horrifying that even experienced detectives described it as one of the most psychologically disturbing investigations they had ever encountered. Matsunaga was born in 1961 in Kitakyushu, a city in Fukuoka Prefecture in southern Japan. From an early age, he displayed a talent for manipulating people. Friends and acquaintances later described him as charming and persuasive when he wanted something, but also capable of sudden cruelty and intimidation. As a young adult, he moved through a series of questionable schemes and small-time frauds. He operated businesses that often collapsed under suspicious circumstances and frequently borrowed money from people he barely knew. Many of these relationships ended badly, with victims realizing too late that they had been deceived. But Matsunaga's most dangerous skill was not financial fraud, it was psychological control. By the 1990s, he had formed a relationship with a woman named Junko Ogata, who would eventually become deeply involved in his crimes. Matsunaga quickly established dominance over her through a combination of manipulation, emotional pressure, and threats. He convinced Ogata that he possessed powerful connections and that disobeying him could bring terrible consequences. Over time, her independence slowly disappeared. Under Matsunaga's influence, Ogata began assisting him in various schemes, believing that their actions were necessary for survival. Their relationship became increasingly toxic and dangerous, setting the stage for what would eventually unfold. The crimes began with financial disputes. Matsunaga often targeted people who owed him money or who had previously been involved in his business dealings. Instead of resolving conflicts normally, he began inviting these individuals to his apartment under friendly pretenses. Once they arrived, the situation changed dramatically. Victims were sometimes confined inside the apartment, where Matsunaga used intimidation and violence to control them. He frequently employed a shocking tactic that investigators later described in court. He would force family members to turn against each other. Through psychological manipulation and threats, he convinced victims that their own relatives had betrayed them or planned to harm them. In some cases, he forced people to participate in punishing their own family members. The apartment became a place of fear and control. Matsunaga used electric shocks, beatings, and constant intimidation to break down his victims' resistance. Those trapped inside were often deprived of sleep and subjected to relentless psychological pressure. Over time, the boundaries between victim and participant began to blur. Some people inside the apartment were manipulated into assisting Matsunaga because they believed it was the only way to survive. One of the most shocking aspects of the case was how ordinary families became entangled in the nightmare. Parents, siblings, and relatives were brought into the apartment under various excuses. Once inside, they found themselves trapped in a system of fear carefully constructed by victims were forced to accuse each other of imaginary betrayals. Punishments were inflicted based on these accusations, creating an atmosphere where trust completely disappeared. The cruelty escalated gradually but relentlessly. Several victims eventually died as a result of the abuse and violence inside the apartment. Instead of reporting the deaths, Matsunaga forced others to help conceal what had happened. Investigators later discovered that bodies were dismembered and disposed of in an attempt to eliminate evidence. For years, the crimes remained hidden. Neighbors occasionally noticed unusual behavior or loud arguments coming from the apartment, but no one fully understood the scale of what was happening inside. Meanwhile, Matsunaga continued manipulating the people around him, ensuring that fear prevented anyone from speaking out. The situation might have continued indefinitely if not for one critical mistake. In 2002, authorities began investigating a separate fraud complaint connected to Matsunaga's activities. As detectives examined his background, they noticed inconsistencies involving missing individuals linked to him. These suspicions led to a deeper investigation. When police finally began questioning people connected to Matsunaga, the truth slowly began to emerge. Witnesses described the terrifying environment inside the apartment and the psychological manipulation that had kept victims under control for so long. Investigators were stunned by the complexity of the crimes. This was not a typical serial murder case. Instead, it was a system of domination where one man had used fear, deception, and psychological warfare to control entire families. As evidence mounted, authorities arrested Futoshi Matsunaga and Junko Ogata. The trial that followed shocked Japan. Court testimony revealed how Matsunaga had systematically broken down the willpower of those around him. Survivors described being forced to participate in acts they never believed they were capable of committing. The psychological pressure had been so intense that some victims genuinely believed they would be killed if they disobeyed him. The case forced Japanese society to confront difficult questions about manipulation and human vulnerability. How could one individual gain such complete control over others? Why had victims not escaped earlier? Psychologists later explained that Matsunaga had used classic techniques of coercive control, isolating victims, creating constant fear, and convincing them that resistance would lead to worse consequences. In that environment, rational decision-making gradually collapsed. During the trial, prosecutors detailed the deaths connected to the case and the methods Matsunaga had used to dominate his victims. The evidence left little doubt about the extent of his crimes. Eventually, the court delivered its verdict. Matsunaga was found guilty of multiple murders and other serious crimes. Because of the extreme cruelty and manipulation involved, the court sentenced him to death. Junko Ogata was also convicted and received a lengthy prison sentence for her role in the crimes. The verdict brought some measure of closure, but the case left a lasting scar on Japanese society. Many people struggled to understand how such atrocities could occur within an ordinary apartment building in a modern city. For investigators and psychologists, the case became one of the most studied examples of extreme coercive control and manipulation. The name Futoshi Matsunaga remains synonymous with one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Japan's modern history, not only because of the violence involved, but because of the terrifying way he turned families against themselves. The apartment where the crimes occurred eventually returned to silence, but the memory of what happened there continues to haunt those who know the story. It was not simply a case of murder. It was a demonstration of how a manipulative mind, combined with cruelty and intimidation, could transform ordinary people into prisoners trapped in a nightmare they struggled to escape. And it stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are not the ones hiding in darkness, but the ones who learn how to control the minds of those around them. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.